Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Welcome to Reflections on the 2021 International AIDS Society Conference on HIV Science. I'm J. Stephen Morrison, Senior Vice President at the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington, D.C., where I head up CSIS's work on global health. This event is sponsored jointly with the Kaiser Family Foundation, a very close and dear partner over many, many years. My co-host is Jennifer Cates, also a close friend, who is Senior Vice President at Kaiser Family Foundation and Director of Global Health and HIV Policy. We've been in the habit for 2 decades of jointly organizing these post-IAS conference events. We have with us in person this morning 2 good friends and noted HIV experts, Chris Byrer and Maureen Good. Chris is Professor of Epidemiology at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and he's the prior president of the International AIDS Society, 2014 to 2016. Maureen is Associate Director for AIDS Research at the National Institutes of Health and Director of the NIH Office of AIDS Research. We have coming in remotely Adiba Kamarulzaman, President of the International AIDS Society. Welcome, Adiba. She's the former Dean of the Faculty of Medicine and is a Professor of Medicine and Infectious Diseases at the University of Malaysia in Kuala Lumpur. Welcome, Adiba. We're delighted you could be with us today.
Thank you for having me.
This is a hybrid event. We have several experts in the audience. We'll be calling upon them as we get towards the end of the hour to come in with some questions. And we're delighted to welcome them. Special thanks to our colleagues at the Global Health Policy Center, particularly Mackenzie Burks, Michael Rendelman, Noel Hoon, who's come to help us today. Special thanks to our CSIS production team, Graham McGillivray, Emma Coburn, Mary Wright, Danish Matani, and we're delighted that C-SPAN can join us today to broadcast this event. We have only 1 hour and a lot of ground to cover. I will offer a few additional remarks on this moment that we find ourselves in. Jennifer will offer some welcoming remarks, and then we will hear quick opening remarks, beginning with Adiba, Maureen, and Chris, and then we'll have a conversation that follows that. In terms of where we are right now, this moment, this conversation occurs at a moment of a major transition in the COVID-19 pandemic, and there's no avoiding talking about that, and I'm sure we will. We're at the 18-month mark, and it's a moment of accelerating change. It's an existential moment in a way. We saw that last night in President Biden's impassioned speech announcing major new federal approaches to vaccinations. We saw it earlier in the week by major changes in CDC masking, and we saw it last night in the release of the CDC slide deck on the Delta variant. We know now that we are facing a virus in the Delta variant that is of new levels of danger, destructive power, and perniciousness. It's winning in many parts of the world. We have entered a long war. This is not one that is going to be short, and it's a painful race. It's a 3-continental sweep that we're seeing today in terms of the surge, now surging in Africa, but extending into Southeast Asia, South Asia, and across Latin America. Obviously, here in the United States, we've had major gains in vaccine coverage, but we are struggling. We're at a moment of fear and uncertainty. What are we seeing in much of the world? In much of low and middle-income countries, we're seeing gross inequity in terms of affordable access to vaccines and to critical inputs, PPE, oxygen. We're seeing critical shortages in the health workforce. There's enormous uncertainty surrounding what are the gains achieved through vaccines. And there's obviously disproportionate impacts on key populations, on women and girls, and the health impacts. We'll hear more about this today in terms of the disproportionate impacts on people living with HIV. We know that many countries have acute lack of readiness in terms of financing and delivery mechanisms. As we move towards greater abundance of vaccines, there's this question of how are these countries going to manage that? We're seeing rising instability as a cascade of the pandemic, of humanitarian emergencies, fiscal insolvency, and risk of famine and violent instability. We're seeing this in South Africa, Lebanon, Myanmar, Haiti, Cuba, just to name a few of the most notable cases. This is a tough world that we're in right now to be talking about the achievements, sustaining the achievements of HIV, along with other global health gains. We'll talk today about trying to answer some of the uncertainties. How much impact is COVID-19 having upon existing HIV programs? How much damage, how deep, how lasting, how much resilience? We know that prevention services have suffered, enrollment, diversion of staff, lab resources, finances. We know that there's exhaustion in many places. We know that there's a risk of regression, a risk of reignition of pandemics in HIV, TB, elsewhere. We know that there's uncertainty right now and a growing debate on where does HIV fit in this new world, a world in which we have an ongoing endemic coronavirus pandemic. The geopolitics surrounding this have not been very promising. We had a complete absence of high-level diplomacy in the first year of this epidemic in 2020. We had some progress at the G7, but it was pretty disappointing overall in terms of the mobilization. And with that uncertainty is uncertainty of where will the solutions come from and who will lead. Right now, the solutions that are coming forward, COVAX and others, are quite promising, but they fall far short of the scale of what's required. And they put at risk, all of this puts at risk, I believe, HIV achievements and the ability to sustain progress as we look forward. So thank you all for joining us, and I'm going to turn to my close friend and ally here this morning, Jennifer Cates, to kick things off. Jennifer.
Thanks, Steve, and hi, everyone. It's great to be able to build on our long tradition of collaborating on these sessions focused on the outcomes of the AIDS conferences. And I want to thank our panelists, Adiba, Maureen, and Chris, for being here and sharing your perspectives. Just briefly, in addition to my KFF hat, I'm also a member of the IAS Governing Council, and the IAS, of course, being the steward of these conferences. So I'm very proud of the IAS team under Adiba's leadership to sort of pivoting quickly to create virtual platforms to allow scientists and community and researchers to keep talking about HIV and connecting and moving the field forward despite the obstacles we faced. Steve talked about the larger, uncertain, and dangerous situation we find ourselves in. I want to continue from that vantage point and focus on 4 themes, which I think have bearing on the HIV response and outlook. The first is the economic outlook for countries is at best uncertain. The second, donor government funding for HIV is on shaky ground. The third, the last year and a half have shown us how important the primacy of science is. Will this transfer to HIV? In terms of commitment. And then 4, it's not just science, it never is. It's also human behavior and social determinants. So on the first, the economic outlook, I just wanted to highlight 2 recent reports that came out in the last few days that I think just tell us from their main messages where we are and how we have to think about this. The first is from the IMF, an updated World Economic Outlook released just a few days ago. This is the main message, quote, "Vaccine access has emerged as the principal fault line along which the global recovery splits into 2 blocks. Those that can look forward to further normalization of activity later this year, almost all advanced economies, and those that will still face resurgent infections and rising COVID death tolls. The recovery, however, is not assured even in countries where infections are currently very low, so long as the virus circulates everywhere," end quote. Second, the Federal Reserve, not known for making such statements, came out a couple of days ago in their lead, quote, "The path of the economy continues to depend on the course of the virus. Progress on vaccinations will likely continue to reduce the effects of the public health crisis on the economy, but risks to the economic outlook remain," end quote. And indeed, in our recent research that we just put out, we found that at current rates of vaccine administration around the world, with the current level of vaccines that have been provided to low and middle income countries, coverage in low-income countries will only be at 5% in a year from now. So that is where we are. Second point, donor government funding for HIV is on shaky ground. We just released our new report in conjunction with the IAS meeting and found a little bit of glimmer of what sounds like good news, an increase in donor disbursements for HIV in 2020. But this was almost entirely due to a payout by the US of prior year money. All other donor governments seem to continue to retreat on their bilateral disbursements. They all cut back other than the US. And recovery still remains below pre-pandemic projections, so the environment is fluid. Also, our data in this report reflect prior year political decisions and do not capture the impact of COVID-19 on budget decision-making by donors. Finally, on this point, depending upon the future impact of COVID in low and middle income countries, it's possible that their health needs and economic crisis will grow, therefore needing more, not less, from donor governments on HIV and all else. Emergency funding has been provided, but I think it's an open question as to whether it's enough. Third point, on the primacy of science. The last year and up until today and yesterday, we see every day how important science is to getting us through this. It's demonstrated that to the world, I think. Whether everyone has listened is not necessarily has happened, but it's at least demonstrated it. Something we've known in HIV always, the critical role of science. Will this bolster and reinforce the HIV scientific enterprise or deplete it as HIV researchers move to address COVID? The pipeline may dry up and the bench becomes thin. And then finally, it's not just science. Also, it's human behavior and social determinants, which we've known from HIV from the beginning. It's unfortunately playing out every day with COVID. At least as important as the science is human behavior, which itself is a function of social determinants. This is the X factor. We cannot ignore this when we are talking about an infectious disease like HIV or COVID-19. And now with COVID, despite having some of the most effective vaccines for any disease, we see that human behavior, choices, the complexities of people's lives are determining the course of this pandemic, in some cases more than highly effective vaccines. And added to that is the disinformation, misinformation, and some erosion in the confidence of science that we're all living with. So with this as a little, the real backdrop that I think we have to consider the discussion about HIV, I want to stop here, turn it back to Steve, and look forward to hearing everybody's thoughts.
Thank you, Jen. Adiba, it's great to have you with us. We read over, we assembled some notes from the, summarizing some of the sessions of the conference, and I was really struck by how many eloquent interventions you made over the course of many of these different events. I was also really impressed that Chancellor Merkel came, Minister Spahn on the German side, that we had Dr. Tedros, we had Sumia Swaminathan. There was quite the outpouring of support coming from some of these key personalities and key institutions. Congratulations on that, and congratulations to you and to Birgit Poniatowski and her whole team. So over to you to share with us your sort of top-line reflections on what came out of the conference.
Thank you very much, Steve and Jen and everyone, for inviting me to this, well, it's evening time here, session, and thank you for the compliments on how well the IAS conference went. It really is a credit to Birgit, Kasia, and the IAS team, as well as, of course, the scientific organizing committee. I've got a bit of feedback here. Is that okay on your side? Is it okay on your side?
It's good.
Okay,
it's
all right.
Good.
Okay, so and we're proud to have been able to provide a very rich scientific content for the conference, despite the barriers that trying to arrange a conference as large as this virtually. But I'm glad that many people found the scientific content as well as the platform much easier to navigate this time. So today I'm just going to stick to a couple of themes from track B. So I believe, Maureen, you're going to be touching on HIV cure. I thought that one of the overarching themes that came out from Track B and which overlapped with Track C is the importance of person and patient-centered perspective and care as we move, into managing HIV as a chronic disease. I think, and it's very important in clinics and programs to really focus on a more holistic management of patients, because there were several presentations that focused on the issue of aging and HIV and the problems that this will bring into patients in both high and low and middle income countries. There was a very nice presentation from Prince Kumar from Georgetown University that looked at more than 20,000 patients in a retrospective study of a very large database that looked at the comorbidities and polypharmacy, and what was found that, comparing to people living without HIV, comorbid conditions and polypharmacy is much more prevalent in people living with HIV across, different age groups, and much more prevalent in women. And what I find quite striking, of course, was it was more pronounced among Asian individuals. So all this will naturally add to the burden of managing people living with HIV, and how this will play out in the post-COVID world with, as Jen had just touched on, reduction in finances and the economic impact that COVID has had on countries will naturally, with these comorbidities increasing, the health dollars will put further strain on health systems. The other thing that came out, I think, quite a bit in Track B was in terms of HIV and HIV and aging, and understanding more the pathophysiology and the underlying metabolic changes, as well as the better understanding, of course, of chronic inflammation and the role of monocytes and macrophages in this. Once again, the accelerated aging and increased atherosclerosis that occurs in people living with HIV will naturally add to further burden to health systems in both low and middle income countries. And there was also a report, I think, from WHO of stating, if I'm not mistaken, more than 20% of patients living with HIV now are over the age of 50 in sub-Saharan Africa. And again, as the cohort grow, the problems around multimorbidity and aging will increase. So all this speaks to the need to deliver person-centered care beyond just being focused on the viral load. And Jeff Lazaris from Barcelona led a multi-stakeholder group that published, including myself, in Nature Communications, and we had a symposium on it to look at how can we better monitor and improve a truly holistic health of people living with HIV, combining the three domains of multimorbidity, looking at health-related quality of life, as well as, of course, the important HIV-related stigma and discrimination in a new global goal, sometimes called 490, of HIV beyond viral suppression. So I think hopefully moving forward, we can continue to have further discussions, further research on the importance of managing HIV beyond just trying to achieve the undetected viral level. Along those lines, of course, in terms of providing individualized care, is starting off with my former boss and mentor, Jenny Hoy's wonderful plenary presentation on the changing paradigm of antiretroviral therapy and putting a case for individualized antiretroviral therapy. Of course, there were several studies discussing 2 drug regimens, SALSA study, and others looking at the place for 2 drugs, either as naive regimen or for simplified regimen from a previous 3-drug combination. But as was pointed out, I think further research is needed, particularly in the use of 2-drug regimen in pregnancy, in test and treat strategy, particularly in low and middle income country where the prevalence of hepatitis may be higher, areas where there might be concerns for increased baseline drug resistance, as well as TB and its effect on the HIV reservoir. I guess one of the highlights of the conference in terms of antiretroviral therapy was, of course, further results from long-acting long-acting combinations, particularly drugs such as lenacapavir. There was a presentation on both on naive patients, as well as Capella, the study on multi-drug resistant HIV positive patients with impressive results showing high rate of virologic suppression in patients receiving lenacapavir in combination with baseline background regimen. So I think what IAS 2021 brought hopefully is more results, more confirmation of better medications that can hopefully improve the quality of life in patients who can be given 6 monthly injections. Obviously, there's going to need to be more studies, particularly in terms of rollout of these drugs. There have been concerns of adherence, concern with the long PK tail of these long-acting drugs. But I'm confident that as these drugs get rolled out, that we'll become more familiar with it, and in years to come, that long-acting injectables will be a mainstay of treatment. But more importantly, in line with the I think what our global goals should be in terms of providing person-centered care, that patients will have a choice in terms of the armamentarium of drugs that we can provide to them, whether it's a good old 3-drug regimen but in a combined pill, or some people may prefer a combination with long-acting injectables. So with that, I just want to conclude by saying that the advances in HIV science has been remarkable, but I share Jen's concern and pessimism in terms of what COVID-19 pandemic will do, not just to HIV care, but HIV research. To that end, the IAS Governing Council will be convening a meeting that we hope to, amongst the Governing Council members initially, to see, Sharon Lewin came up with this brilliant idea. She like me, I think, is inherently optimistic person, and we want to kind of, I don't know if capitalize is the right word, but the global attention on global health and the remarkable scientific advances that came with the COVID response. How can we use that to also reinvigorate the HIV research and programmatic efforts with the IAS leading these efforts in the next 12 to 24 months. So with that, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Adiba. And you'll stay with us. We'll come back to you in the course of this conversation. I'm going to turn to Maureen Good now to offer her quick thoughts on what transpired at the conference. Welcome,
Great.
Maureen. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Jen. Nice to see you, Diva, and Chris, and some of the folks in the audience. It's just wonderful to be here. I want to talk about three things quickly, three different topics. One is about the conference itself. Two, Adiba mentioned some of the science, particularly related to cure, and then third, looking forward and how do we work in this environment. So I think the most amazing thing really is that IAS Science 2021 took place given the environment. And not only did it take place, but it was an amazing success. And it was technologically a success and a scientific success. And really this reflects the tremendous job that Adiba and Birgit Pontikowski and all of their staff and colleagues contributed to the event. I was struck by hearing some initial analysis that despite the fact that it was totally virtual, we had more attendees than at the in-person meetings, and that there were more funds available for junior investigators and scholarships because the costs were reduced because they weren't traveling. I think that is a testimony to the resiliency of the scientific community in this area, and we should be celebrating this. And I think it's also a testimony, HIV and the persistence of COVID, but the extent to which the HIV field pivoted expertise to develop the safe and effective vaccines in less than a year. So then, next step then is what was actually discussed at the meeting, and I was struck by the significant component of the agenda that was related to cure, and it was really across the sort of pipeline of cure, if you will, because it started really with consideration of reservoirs, continued discussions and discoveries in how to maintain long-term viral suppression, and how can all of these events be used to develop and expand the opportunities for developing cure strategies. I think understanding the reservoirs and the relationship with viral replication, the continued discovery of how the virus interacts with the cells is amazing. And I don't know if you saw some of the images of the virus actually working its way through the interior of a cell. And as a virologist, I just find this amazingly exciting. And it's really providing us with granular data about how the virus is working so that we can look and identify more targets that can be used for developing drugs. And the whole new strategy and the whole new series of drugs that are based on disruption of viral assembly, because it integrates into disrupts the capsid formation, is a whole new class of drugs, and it's really, really exciting from that perspective. I think cure itself is maturing. There's a lot of strategic planning going on in terms of target product profiles, the partnerships that have been developed and continue for discovering cure strategies, I think we're in place and really set up a framework for the COVID partnerships that developed very quickly in order to develop the vaccines. So that, and I think the other piece of this too is that we need to continue to understand the vulnerabilities of the virus and how can we avoid development of drug resistance. And there were some presentations on that, and I think it's an important point that needs to be kept on the horizon, or on the table actually. So I think the continued challenges of the policies, however, that promote an environment of stigma and discrimination are a real barrier and present real challenges to the research enterprise. And I think one of the real advantages of the IAS Science 2021 and that whole type of conference is really having the basic science integrated with the clinical, the translational, and implementation as well, and with the policy pieces. you can sort of see the whole picture, and it's a very exciting environment to be in. And I know from some of the junior investigators who were there, the fact that they could really see where they fit into this environment is a really important part of this meeting, and it's fantastic. So quickly then, looking forward, and how the major questions of discovery in the future, and how do we sustain our enterprise, how can we rebuild it, and how do we pivot it in this environment? Because I think, this fierce persistence of new infections, which I think was some wording that you used in one of your CSIS publications, this fierce persistence of new infections is true not only for COVID, but also for HIV. We're 40 years into the pandemic. There's been a remarkable return on the investment over these years, but I think we can really take advantage of this time to critically evaluate the portfolio, right size, adjust, and pivot, and make space and resources available for next steps.
Thanks, Maureen. Chris Byron.
Well, that was a perfect segue, Maureen. Thank you very much, because the fierce persistence of new infections, really the problem of HIV incidence, is exactly what the prevention science part of the conference is trying to address. And I think we all have understood that there was a tremendous effort on the part of just countless providers and clinicians across PEPFAR and national governments to ensure that in the COVID pandemic there were not treatment interruptions. Everybody understood the centrality of trying to keep people on treatment. But many, many domains of healthcare that you would put in the category of elective, like, for example, do I need an HIV test today? Is it worth going to the clinic and risking exposure to COVID? Or should I refill that PrEP prescription? These really, I think, were more profoundly affected than the treatment area. And so we're going to be analyzing for a very long time the impact of COVID-19 on that aspect of the HIV pandemic. But we should be clear that based on the 2019 data, and everybody will remember that 2020 was supposed to be the year that we were going to achieve all these targets, or the last targets, we already knew, and we were publishing on this and many others did, that in 2018 and 2019 we were not going to make those 2020 targets in reduction of new infections, that incidence was a remaining problem. Now, UNAIDS report, of course, they always very graciously put those out around the time of our conferences so people have them to be able to look at, made clear that we now are seeing that key populations, the most vulnerable, the most likely to be excluded from prevention services, account for the majority of infections globally. Right? And that, again, was true in 2019, and there's no reason to think that it isn't even more true in 2020. So I think what that says to us is that this really is the challenge ahead of us. The exciting thing from the science, which I'll get into in a moment, is that we are in an era of expanding choice, of expanding potency, finally of some uptake and good news about adherence and persistence on PrEP, including among women and girls in sub-Saharan Africa, so definitely want to highlight those positive findings. We're really coming into the era of choice. But our challenge is going to be delivery and uptake and doing differentiated prevention that actually reaches the people who need it most in ways that work with their lives and for which they're willing to use. And that really is going to be an enormous challenge. It would have been anyway, but in the era of COVID and when all of the countries that share the unfortunate reality of high HIV burdens and high COVID burdens and low COVID vaccine access, this is an enormously challenging period for governments and ministries and programs to keep the eye on HIV prevention. As I said, we're doing wonderfully with treatment, but keeping the eye on HIV prevention in the middle of this context is very challenging. So what is the good news? Well, the REACH study, which looked at open label use of PrEP and the dapivirine vaginal ring in African women and girls, showed surprisingly better adherence, around 50%, but that's way better than what had been seen in the trials with some of these products. And ongoing persistence. So women and girls appeared to be willing, after starting and adhering, to persist on these agents, much more with higher tolerance and higher acceptability. And of course, again, the choice. Do you want oral PrEP or would you rather have a dapivirine ring? Starts to really make a difference for people. We had good news from GEMS. So GEMS was a very large study that was joint with PEPFAR, USAID, and the Microbicide Trial Network. Over 100,000 people followed in PrEP programs. And the question that they were really looking at and interested in is, among people on PrEP, and these are real-world settings, Kenya, Eswatini, South Africa, how much drug resistance are we seeing in people who acquire HIV while on these PrEP programs? Because that, of course, is an existential threat. As Maureen mentioned, antiviral resistance really is a challenge. So it turns out, first of all, that there were not that many infections. The infection rate overall is about 0.2%. That's amazing, right? That is amazing. These are places where the incidence in people not using preventive measures and not accessing PrEP is generally around 2% or higher. So that is a log decline. Okay? That in and of itself is important. But most of the drug resistance that they did find turned out to be from the infected partners who had transmitted to somebody. It was not primary PrEP resistance. That's not what was emerging, so that also is very good news. It again appears to be largely that the people who acquired HIV were not adherent to PrEP. We've known that for a long time. There was important data on Kenyan providers and messaging around PrEP and treatment as prevention. So it turns out that there's a whole global movement around U equals U, undetectable equals untransmissible. It is a message that is challenging for many African providers, as it turns out. And the concerns that emerged were concerns about viral rebound, about increasing medical mistrust, and also about the concern that partners might be blamed if they had a viral breakthrough and transmitted to their loved one. Other data from Kenya that also were encouraging were about the use of community pharmacies, so trying to demedicalize PrEP and decentralize it, get it out to community pharmacies, and that turned out to be both feasible and highly acceptable. So that is really good news. More real-world data on the challenge of PrEP and the likelihood of increasing sexually transmitted infections. So this was a big study from MSM in the UK, about 180,000 PrEP users and a very high rate of STIs in some of them. But it turned out that about a quarter of the men accounted for 80% of all infections, and most of those men had repeated STIs. So what it really looks like is that there is a small group of people who are at higher risk, and when they looked at what the characteristics of those men were, they're younger, and they had African, Caribbean, Black ancestry. So marginalized younger folks, not dissimilar at all to what we see in the US, and telling us really that PrEP works, but it has to go along with support and other kinds of programmatic support for the folks most at risk. Disturbing news on self-testing and the rollout of self-testing in sub-Saharan Africa. WHO study from 9 countries, very low awareness, and only 2% of adults reported ever having had an HIV self-test. So that's a technology with a lot of potential, particularly in the COVID era, where we want to keep people out of clinics where they might encounter COVID, but very low uptake for now. Good news on STI self-testing and self-screening, in this case from the Tangerine Clinic in Bangkok, which is a leading provider of care for transgender persons. They basically did a study of comparing physician STI screening or provider STI screening with self-screening among transgender women, including women with neovaginal self-screening for those who'd had vaginoplasty. And they did just as well as the providers. Equal efficacy, sensitivity, specificity. So that's also really important. There was more data from CAB-LA. So you heard Professor Adiba talking about long-acting cabotegravir and lenacapavir in the treatment space and the potential there. But of course, it also is a prevention tool. So there were, in the 084, HPTN 084 trial, this was the head-to-head comparison, double dummy, double placebo-controlled trial of long-acting cabotegravir versus TDF-FTC. There were 40 infections overall in that trial, only 4 in CAB-LA, 36 in the FTC arm. So CAB-LA really showing extraordinarily better efficacy. But what's really important is that Mark Marzinke from Hopkins looked at the viruses in those 40 folks who seroconverted. So it turns out that in the CAB-LA arm, 3 of the seroconverters were people who were not getting CAB-LA injections at all. And the only one who did get CAB-LA injections, it turned out, had actually acquired HIV acutely before the trial really started, before the first injection. So that underscores why we really have to be doing high-quality screening before we start people on this, but also essentially that nobody got infected who was using it. And that also turned out to be true with the 36 people who acquired HIV who were on FTC. Tenofovir. So that is really very encouraging, and the overall efficacy, of course, is extraordinarily high. This raises another issue that Lynn Morris in her vaccine plenary brought up and that others brought up, and that is that our prevention tools right now are reaching such high levels of efficacy, and we have so many choices, and presuming that CAB-LA is going to be approved, which we think it will be relatively soon, perhaps this year, we're going to not be able to do placebo-controlled randomized trials in the old way. And the control condition is going to have such low incidence that we really are going to be in a challenging place for prevention studies going forward. And that is really going to be an issue for the vaccine trials for primary prevention. So there's a lot of work going on developing counterfactual modeled incidence designs, looking at community incidence, looking, for example, at the rate of infection that you identify acute infection in people screened for these trials and using that as the incidence measure. And in the past, the FDA and others have been very reluctant to go down this road. But the recognition, I think, now is there isn't any choice. The next generation of trials are going to look very different. So I will just summarize by saying that what people really, if you look across the prevention and implementation science, what people wanted was for our prevention efforts to be simplified, to be differentiated and patient-centered, to be demedicalized, and to be integrated with other services. And I think that really, for me, is the path forward. We have many more tools. We've got to figure out who wants them, how to get them to them, who's going to use what, and we're going to have new designs for the next generation of products to reduce incidence.
Thanks, Chris. Jen's going to lead off one quick round of conversation among us, and then I want to encourage those in our audience. We have a number of notable experts in the audience to come forward. There's a mic over here, and pose some questions so that we can have some exchange with the audience in the balance of time. We've got about 15 minutes, and then we'll wrap. Jen and I will offer some wrap-up remarks to close things. Over to you, Jen.
Great, thanks. Very quickly, one common theme between what Chris and Adiba talked about was choice, sort of patient, individual client choice, and I think that was a theme I heard at the conference, which is great that we're there. Adiba, this is not really a scientific question, but just because we don't have a lot of time, would you talk a little bit more or highlight what, looking ahead to AIDS 2022, just so everybody here and listening kind of knows where we're headed at IAS and what to look forward to for AIDS 22.
So I think, thanks Jen, I think building on the conversation, if you like, from IAS 2021, some of those themes that we've heard mentioned tonight, but really the conference theme is to reinvigorate and to follow the science. So, hopefully in the next 12 months as we prepare to see good science being put together, I'm pretty sure we'll hear more about the HIV cure research. We'll hope to hear some more advances in DNAPs and and the long-acting as the studies, the clinical trials evaluation continues. But as it's a bigger AIDS conference, hopefully we'll also hear more around stigma and discrimination, radicalization, HIV as well, not so much HIV, but key populations around the world, policies around that. So I hope there will be vigorous debate around many of the factors that continue to prevent us from AIDS.
Adiba, in your planning for Montreal next summer, it's a hybrid. What's your thinking in terms of the likely in-person participation? What's that likely to look like?
Yeah, so as Maureen said, we were very pleasantly surprised that for this Berlin conference, we actually had 6,500 participants, which was actually higher than Mexico City and close to some of the other in-person conferences for the HIV Science. But we also hear of many, our colleagues who are yearning to have the face-to-face conferences, their conference, with all the benefits that bring. But at the same time, we're cognizant of the fact that, as you said, probably 5% of in terms of vaccine coverage, and we know that for the entire continent of Africa now at about 5% vaccine coverage. So the idea of preparing for the hybrid conference is, knowing that much of America will hopefully be vaccinated by then, but also acknowledging that persons in Africa and to some extent Asia will not be able to continue to benefit from the conference. And we will continue to provide scholarships, as Maureen indicated, but just to let you know that because we're preparing actually two versions of the conference, it will be a lot more costly than doing one or the other.
Thank you. Thank you. Greg Millet's with us. Greg, would you just introduce yourself and give us your question?
Sure. Good morning. My name is Greg Millet. I am the Director of Public Policy at AMFAR. Thank you for a wonderful discussion and information on what took place for IAS 2021. One thing I didn't hear was HIV COVID co-infection. There were those data that came out from WHO showing that we might have a global north, global south divide in terms of transmissibility of COVID among people living with HIV. And given some of the data that Jen gave in terms of low-income countries, and then the next year only 5% of individuals in low-income countries might expect to have access to COVID vaccines, what exactly does this mean for people living with HIV moving forward as we move towards more virulent strains of COVID in terms of not only controlling the virus, but also getting to the goals that we all aspire to get to by 2030?
Chris, you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, it's such an important question. And as you know, I'm sure, Greg, the studies have been mixed, and there's quite a lot of information that we still really need to understand. In the IAS members meeting, Salim Abdul Karim did just an absolutely beautiful talk summarizing all the available data. And his sort of takeaway was that there clearly is an effect of HIV on the likelihood of having worse COVID outcomes, hospitalizations, and death. And there's a big debate about what we should control for and what we shouldn't. But it comes out to be about sort of in the 10% increased likelihood range. It's not a huge difference, but it appears that it's a real difference. What that means, and what I think all of us came away from, is that it is extremely important that people living with HIV be prioritized for immunization. That is very important. And that people, particularly who have immunocompromise or with their HIV infection, or who are not virally suppressed, or who have other risk factors which differ. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa, they're much more likely to have a history of TB. That those folks also really need to be prioritized for immunization. And ideally with high efficacy vaccines, with mRNA vaccines, and with J&J. And as you know, there's a big debate about whether people with immunosuppression, immunocompromise should be boosted. That science is unfolding, but certainly many folks living with HIV would also fit into that category.
Maureen and Adiba, did you have thoughts, Maureen, on this question? Greg, do you have any further?
I do.
Yes.
I do.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I think we also use the IAS 2021 platform to kind of call out the need for us, the scientific community, to do more to raise especially with the WHO findings, to really reinvigorate our advocacy and our activism, just as we did at previous AIDS conferences for antiretroviral therapy.
Yeah.
I truly do think, particularly with the variants that's raging around the world, certainly I'm experiencing that in Malaysia, although for Asia we're doing quite well in terms of vaccination, but still we're not able to catch up in many states around Malaysia just because of vaccine supply, and the number of infections and deaths are just skyrocketing. So perhaps as the what the HIV community is so well known for, perhaps we need to make a stronger, louder rallying cry for vaccine equity across the world.
Right. And I think one of the advantages of the mRNA approach is that you can tweak this with a lot more ease than the traditional vaccine platforms. And so I think to that extent, we have some advantages, and I think some of these have already been starting to be developed.
Great. We have a question from Matthew Cavanagh. Matt, introduce yourself, please, and your question.
Great, thanks. Matt Cavanagh from Georgetown University at the O'Neill Institute and the Department of International Health. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about kind of access thinking about the long-acting injectables. This is just really remarkable science that's coming both on the prevention side and on the treatment side. It's just so good to see. I wonder what came out of the conference related to who's likely to benefit most. Because one of the things it seems to me we really need to be moving toward is planning for how do we actually get these to the communities where it will make the biggest impact on incidence and on mortality. And I wonder if there was any data that came out that showed us anything on that front. Thanks.
Adiba?
Yeah. I'll follow her.
Okay.
So Matthew, what I saw was mostly studies in, not specifically addressing issues like the long-actings in as prep for key populations. I think, of course, we've had the results from. I'm blanking out now from that looked at cisgender and transgender that was presented at in South Africa, the HIV R4P. There was nothing specific, I think, in IAS 2021 looking at key populations that I can remember, and I don't think there are studies designed for this long-acting, both the oral and the injectables, that for instance, for people who inject drugs. I don't know, Chris, are you aware? And certainly, you know, from previous experiences, it's going to take a long time for the pricing for these drugs to make it affordable in lower middle income countries.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. The 084 data on the seroconverters basically is very compelling data that Cab-LA injectable is clearly far superior for women and girls. And for many, you know, those were of course all women and girls in sub-Saharan Africa. They fit into a key population for many reasons. So that's very encouraging. The 083, which was the Americas trial, you know, which was MSM and trans women, also showed superiority. You know, it was very clear superiority. That the analyses of those viruses, I don't know, is out yet. So we haven't had a chance to look at that. But there's no question, I think, that people are thinking about these as potentially very important for adolescents. Mm-hmm. You know, for adolescent key populations who are clearly at risk, and sex workers, women and girls at risk. So I think that, you know, there is some differentiation happening there already. There also was data on Merck's new drug, islatravir, which is a unique, different mechanism, reverse transcriptase inhibitor. It's a novel mechanism that a very small dose is just essentially blocks viral replication for a month. It is a really remarkable drug, and it's probably going to be also, you know, long-acting, but maybe also depot, and maybe also in an implant, because it just has very favorable pharmacokinetics. I mean, the once-a-month pill is the size of a baby aspirin, just to give you a feel. So there are, the small molecules are really coming, and they're impressive.
We're getting to the end of our hour here. Here's what I propose we do. I'm going to offer a very quick set of remarks, of impressions from this. Ask Jen to do the same. Then we're going to come back to our three speakers with just a very quick answer to the question of what gives you hope and confidence and optimism in this period of crisis. So prepare yourselves. Adiba, you're going to get the last word today. Some quick impressions. One, this is a very strong community. This scientific community is a very strong community, and it's showing remarkable resilience. And I hope it will use its voice in the coming period to bring about, to really draw attention to the R&D enterprise is endangered and in risk. The population served and the services are at risk. And we've seen here in the United States, Zeke Emanuel put together a letter, 60 health providers around vaccinations, which had huge impact. I think there is a role for using that voice very strategically of this very strong community. I'm struck at how much U.S. dependence has grown. It continues to grow, and the essential leadership that the U.S. plays, and we have a gap at the moment, and we need to correct for that gap. And we are in, final point, we're in an era of anti-science. We're trying to conduct science in an anti-science era of disinformation and falsehoods and attacks upon the scientific enterprise, and it's endangering trust and confidence among the people that we serve. And I think that has to be a top-line priority looking ahead, and I hope to learn and see more. I know you addressed this in the course of the meetings, and I hope we'll see that much focus on all of these issues as we head towards Montreal. Thank you. Jen? Your thoughts?
Sure. Very quickly, I started with one of the points I made was that it's not just science. We need to think about people's lived experience and the choices the things they choose to do and the things that they don't have choice about. Well, to pick up on Matt's comment, it's also not just science. We have to think about how we get science to people. in the future, and we have to be planning about it right now. So it's not just how their lives are constrained or conscripted now, it's in the future. But because there's so much that was said, I'm going to yield the rest of my time to everybody else and look for your thoughts from you guys.
Thank you, Jen. So Maureen, we're going to go to you for what gives you strength, optimism, confidence looking ahead, then to Chris, and then Adiba's going to close.
Okay, 3 points quickly. One is optimism. We've got 2 big vaccine trials that are going to be reading out over the next year, year and a half. Secondly, with these amazing choices that we have of these new formulations, it just means we have to increase our investment in implementation science and figuring out what people want in different settings and even at different stages of their lives. And then thirdly, you mentioned, Steve, that the research community is resilient, but it's not a lack of optimism, but I am concerned about the fragile infrastructure and funding and getting across how research investment is an investment and it's not a cost. How are we going to continue the investment in the research enterprise and get recovery to the level that we can continue the good work that's been started?
Thank you, Maureen. Chris?
Well, I have hope because there's always science, and science, even in this very anti-scientific time, delivered these extraordinarily effective vaccines in an unbelievable record time. I think one of the things that's going to happen for the HIV movement is that we're going to be increasingly informed by the success of this vaccine movement for COVID on many levels. And hopefully that is going to help us get out of this place where the mistrust in science is such a challenge. I just want to say one other thing, which is I neglected at the beginning, to thank Maureen and the NIH for their sustained and continued engagement with IAS and in the conferences. Adiba and I are writing our 13th Montreal right now, and we greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, Chris. Adiba, we're so grateful that you've been with us for this hour. It's just terrific and so valuable. So offer your closing thoughts, please.
Thanks very much, Steve. And in terms of optimism and strength, I think the investment that the US and the global scientific community have put into HIV/AIDS, obviously, as we know, paid off for COVID as well. So I think moving forward, that long-term investment will continue to serve us well. We saw many good science being presented at the virtual conference, and I remain optimistic that this good science will continue, even if there will probably be some setback in terms of funding. But the energy that was transmitted, I think, even virtually for many presenters was quite amazing, and particularly young researchers, I think, continue to have much fire in their belly to solve the problems of HIV all around the world. So I remain optimistic, and like I said, the IAS hope to convene a meeting to see how the advances that happened in the last 18 months with COVID science and research, we can incorporate that to reinvigorate HIV research as well.
Thank you, Adiba, and thank you, Chris and Maureen, and a thanks to Jen and Kaiser Family Foundation for partnering with us, and thanks to everyone who's joined us remotely and in person, and to all of the CSIS staff who put this rather complicated event together. Those of you who are here in person, we're going to have a reception with an early lunch, so please do join us right out on the patio, and we are adjourned.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, Adiba. Bye.